Hello, my name is Garchompro. I've been Challenger since Set 2, and I'm currently top 10 NA, and today what I wanted to talk about was how to position every new unit in Set 8.5. There's a lot of small positioning quirks that I want to be able to talk about, as well as general positioning guidelines for these units, to hopefully help you manage where you place them on your board correctly, as positioning completely swings fights from Stage 2 to the end of the game. So I'm going to go by cost. There's going to be chapters in the description, so if you're only interested in a unit or two, you can go look at that. Or if you're interested in everything, you can sit through and watch the entire video. So the first unit we're going to talk about here is Lucian. Now, Lucian's ult is interesting in that he targets the unit he is currently auto-attacking, ulting in a straight line, but his ult hits the first unit. So the most obvious example of this is, let's say he is autoing the enemy Renekton, as shown right here. If your opponent is to hacker, let's say a Pyke onto the Lucian, if the Lucian ults, it'll actually hit the Pyke instead of the Renekton, as the Pyke is between the Renekton and the Lucian. So you can either abuse this if you want to save your frontliners by throwing a hacker in front of the Lucian to eat an ult, or be cognizant of this if you don't want your hacker to get hit by a Lucian ult, make sure it doesn't hit in front of the Lucian and instead goes to the side. Now, there's actually some positioning tricks you can do to cause the Lucian to ult a different unit than what he would be normally hitting. Let's say the Lucian is running this Poppy as his frontline, and the Poppy is here with the Lucian in the corner right here. Now, let's say your opponent puts a Renekton right here, and then puts a Blitzcrank right behind the Renekton right here. What's going to happen is the Renekton and Poppy will start autoing each other, and the Lucian will auto the Renekton, and the Blitzcrank is going to walk up right here and start autoing the Poppy. Now, what's going to happen is the Lucian is autoing the Renekton, the Poppy is autoing the Renekton, so the Renekton is going to be the one taking the most of the damage. But when Lucian comes to ult, he's going to ult towards the Renekton, but the Blitzcrank will body block the ult and eat the ult for the Renekton. Now, this might not seem like a big issue, and late game it might not be, but early game focus fire is extremely important. Early game, you always want to be focus firing one unit down the entire time. You don't want to be swapping around. It's why Prankster Crest is so powerful early game, because it causes a de-aggro and splits the focus fire. So if you see a Lucian, one tech you can do is have your unit walk around like this to split the focus fire. That way the autos and the ults are hitting different units, meaning that both your units will live longer instead of one dying than the other, right? Because at this point, your Renekton is going to live twice as long as if he was focused entirely first, which is very valuable. Typically, Lucian, if there's an Infiniteam hacks early game, you just want to put him in the Infiniteam hacks. Otherwise, you typically want to be putting your Lucian in the corners. In addition, to counter the positioning I talked about earlier, this is relatively easy. All you have to do is move your tank over to the side like this. If your tank is right here, your Lucian will of course always actually hit the unit it's trying to ult. Even if the opponent has another unit, let's say another Renekton that walks over right here, your Lucian should always be hitting whichever target it's autoing in this. If you were to move your Poppy over here, again, you could potentially have the same issue if the Blitzcrank is back here. It could come right here. But of course, if the opponent doesn't do this positioning where they throw the unit at hex backs, it would be fine. For instance, let's say they position like this, where the units are right next to each other. The Lucian starts autoing the Blitzcrank. Even if the Blitzcrank walks over here like this, he'll ult the Blitzcrank, so you'll be focus firing the Blitzcrank correctly. Alright, next I want to talk about Pantheon. So Pantheon, of course, is a frontliner. And the important thing about Pantheon is that he has single target CC. What this means is generally you want Pantheon to be the same size as your carry. Let's say we're carrying this Lucian here. You generally want the Pantheon and the Lucian to be on the same side. The reason for this is, for one, so that way they can focus fire, and two, being able to CC the tank that your carry is autoing is much more valuable than CCing another tank, right? Let's say my Lucian is autoing a unit right here, maybe let's say an Annie, right? But I have my Pantheon over here who's ulting some random unit, let's say this Blitzcrank. When the Pantheon ults the Blitzcrank, not much is going to happen. It's going to ult the Blitzcrank's going to sit there, and then the Blitzcrank's going to ult, right? The Blitzcrank's a tank, it's not doing damage. It doesn't inherently care about being CC'd. However, if you CC a tank that's in front of your carry, this has a lot of value, because what will happen is your carry will damage the Annie and she'll get to full mana. But if she's CC'd with full mana, she won't cast. Now, the value of this is that you can get more damage off before she CCs. If she's low HP and she's full mana, normally she would ult, but if you CC her while she's low HP, you'll kill her. And then even if she's not low HP, you might be able to reduce it by one ult, because any damage a tank takes while they're full mana is wasted damage, right? Because they're not generating mana. So a unit like Annie will want to generate mana by getting auto-attacked, but won't be able to if she's full mana while CC'd. You can stop a lot of potential strong early game tanks from ulting if you do this. For instance, Nyla, if you can get your Pantheon in front of the Nyla and CC hit while your Lucian's autoing her, she might not ult. And there's plenty of cases of early game tanks that might not ult if your Pantheon ults them. The one exception for this, of course, is if your opponent, let's say, has a frontline carry. Just put your Pantheon, obviously, in front of the frontline carry, as you want to CC that. Being able to CC their carry is more valuable than being able to CC their tank. So if they have a frontline carry, just position in front of that. Otherwise, you want to position it same side as your carry. All right. Next, we have Pyke. Now, Pyke is one of the most interesting units in terms of positioning in the new set. The way Pyke's ult works is that he stabs the unit he's currently hitting, and then dashes to the farthest enemy, hitting all units in the dash. Now, the first and foremost thing is that he stabs the unit he's currently on. So let's say he's currently on this Ashe right here. The stab does damage, and the dash will do damage. What this means is you ideally want your Pyke to jump onto the carry, as it'll do the extra stab damage in addition to the dash damage. Now, obviously, a lot of times Pyke will be hackered, and then sometimes Pyke won't be hackered as you're not choosing to hacker your Pyke. Ideally, if it's hackered, you want it to jump onto the enemy carry. And ideally, if it's not hackered, you want it to be opposite side of their carry. For instance, let's say it's not hackered and it's autoing this Poppy, then it's always going to jump from this Poppy over to this Ashe, which if the Ashe is the carry, will allow us to CC it and damage it. Now, there are ways to play around this. For instance, let's say I am the Ashe player, and I don't want the Pyke to be ulting onto my Ashe. Let's say I'm running this Poppy and this Wukong as my front line, and let's say I'm also running a Kayle in my backline. What I can do here is I can throw this Kayle over to the opposite side. Now what'll happen is if I have the Poppy and Wukong as the same side as my carry, if the Pyke will jump onto the Kayle right here, it's now going to ult upwards into the Poppy instead of ulting onto my Ashe, which is my carry. If it were to jump onto my Ashe, the farthest distance is actually the Kayle, so it'll hit along my backline. So one important thing is if, let's say you have a lot of backline units, right? Let's say I'm running a really backline heavy comp without much frontline, make sure you don't same side your frontliners. You may want to split them up versus Pyke. This way, if Pyke jumps onto bottom left, it'll ult top right, and if it jumps bottom right, it'll ult top left instead of hitting your entire backline. One other important thing to note for Pyke is that if you are running a hacker unit yourself, let's say we're hackering a Warwick, the Pyke will pretty much always jump from whoever he's on to your hackered unit, right? Let's say the Pyke is on this Kayle here, he'll jump up to the Warwick. He's on this Ashe here, he'll jump up to the Warwick as well. There's really not a super easy fix to this. You can kind of skirt around the issue if you run Echo. If, let's say the Pyke is jumping on this Kayle here, you can potentially throw an Echo right here, have him ult backwards like this, and now the Pyke would jump to the Echo instead. But obviously if the Pyke jumps onto the Ashe, it will still jump onto your hackered Warwick. So there's not an easy fix, but this is your best bet. Something like Fiddlesticks can also theoretically do more or less the same thing, although less efficiently than Echo can. In addition, Pyke will a lot of times ult between the same two units. So again, if my carry is bottom right, the Pyke's going to keep ulting between the Kayle and the Poppy, and essentially just bounce back and forth between the two of them. And if he jumps onto the Ashe here, he'll jump over to the Kayle next, and then up to the Poppy. And then if he ults again a third time, he would jump back down to the Kayle. So again, this is the value of having your frontline on the same side as your carry if you're versus Pyke, in that the Pyke will not re-ult back onto your carry, but will ult back onto the frontline, even if it jumps on the carry. Next we have Sivir. Sivir's positioning is relatively basic. She just hits the unit she's autoing. Generally speaking, what I like to do is have my Sivir be auto-attacking the weak frontliner. So you want her on whichever side of the frontline is weaker. The reasoning for this is she's a sure shot. So she can auto-attack the weaker frontline and kill them, and by the time she's auto-attacking their tankier frontline, she has built up some AD from the sure shot scaling, and then is going to have a better time killing the tankier unit. I typically put Sivir on same side as their weaker side, but that's about it for her. Next we have Gnar. Now Gnar is a really interesting unit. Gnar's ult hits in a circle, 2 hexes around him. Now you can look in the game, and you should be able to actually see a blue circle that is around Gnar. And it goes 2 hexes around him. So let's say I place the Gnar right here. I'm going to place units that he'll hit. So he'd hit this hex, this hex, this hex, this hex, this hex, and this hex clearly. Then he'll also hit this hex, he'll hit this hex, he'll hit this hex, and he'll hit this hex as well. And then he should also hit this hex, this hex, this hex, and this hex. From my testing, these are the hexes a Gnar would hit. Yeah, and from what I've seen, these are the hexes a Gnar will hit. Now, the important thing to note with Gnar is that his damage does, I believe, triple to the unit he's currently auto-attacking. So you do want your Gnar to be hitting their most important unit for you. Yeah, so if you want to kill a squishier frontliner or their carry first, you want him to be auto-attacking that. If you want him to kill a tankier frontliner first, you want him to be auto-attacking that. Generally, you want Gnar to be auto-attacking the unit you want him to kill. It's basically just bonus damage he does in a cone. Next we have Morgana. Now Morgana hits the two closest enemies, CCing them. Typically speaking though, let's say we're running Ashe as a carry, you want Morgana to be on the same side as your carry. The reason for this is the fact that her passive allows her to both MR shred and sunder her enemies. Which will cause your carry to do more damage if she is right next to them. So typically you want the Morgana right next to your carry, as it'll cause your carry to do more damage. This has the added benefit of being hacker protection. Let's say there's a Pyke that jumps right here, then it's obviously the closest unit to your Morgana, which will allow your Morgana to CC your carry and buy your carry a bit more time. Similar to what we talked about with Pantheon, you may want to put Morgana and your carry in front of an important tank, as you can CC it and potentially kill it while it's CC'd before it can ult to either restore health, CCAU, make a shield, or whatnot. One other tech you can do is theoretically hacker your Morgana. If you hacker her, just put her in front of their carry. She'll hacker onto the carry and CC it, which can be very valuable. So if you have a hacker in your composition that you're just fitting naturally, but you don't have a great unit to hacker, consider Morgana, as she'll give you some nice CC onto the enemy carry. Next we have Shen. Shen's ult causes damage from your carry to be redirected to him and causes him to get damage reduction. Now, if you have tank items on Shen, let's say you have a Shen 2 with lots of tank items, what I like to do is put Shen on the outside of my front line, right? Let's say I have a couple of frontliners here. I like to put Shen on the outside. The reason is I want him to get autoed, I want him to ult, and I want him to use that 35% damage reduction. When I have a tanky Shen, I really want to play into the 35% damage reduction he gives himself. If I have a less tanky Shen, I may prefer to play into the damage he draws away from your carry. So what I might do is put the Shen in the middle if it's, let's say, a 1-star Shen with no items. This will allow him to actually get value out of drawing damage from your carry, because he won't immediately die. And he has a decently high mana pool. He needs 50 mana cast and has a slowish cast animation. So if he's not 2-star and doesn't have tank items, he might not really cast for the full duration if he's on the outside, or if he's on the inside, he should be able to cast for the full duration. So tanky Shen, I like to put on the outside. Non-tanky Shen, I like to put on the inside. Next we have Vex. Now Vex is interesting because her ult cycles, her first 2 ults hit her target, and then her third ult is going to hit the every unit in a line, right? So for instance, let's say your opponent has this Poppy as their front line. Then first ult, Vex ults the Poppy. Second ult, Vex ults the Poppy. Third ult, however, the Vex is going to ult through the Poppy. So the Vex is going to ult through these hexes, into the Poppy, and through these hexes right here. What this means is ideally what you want to do is put your Vex on the opposite side of their carry. Let's say your opponent is carrying this Ashe here. Here we can clearly see that on the third ult, the Vex will be hitting the Ashe. Now, to deal with this, of course, the Ashe player can move their Poppy to try and prevent this. Now, if you want to raise the odds that your Vex is going to hit the Ashe here, what you can do is, let's say you're running a Blitzcrank as frontline, you can put him into this hex right here. What's going to happen is the Poppy will either path this way or this way. If the Poppy paths this way, the ult should hit the Ashe. And if the Poppy paths this way, the ult should hit the Ashe as well. Now, the Poppy player can, of course, rectify this by throwing the Poppy farther to the side. In this scenario, the Poppy and the Blitz will both walk, and now the ult is no longer hitting the Ashe. So there's really no way to block this. If your opponent doesn't want you to hit their carry, they can do it as long as they put a tanky enough unit in front of your Vex. Obviously, let's say the Poppy isn't the main tank, and your opponent's main tank is, let's say, a Wukong that's right here. Then your Vex will probably kill the Poppy quickly, and then ult the Wukong and end up sniping the Ashe, which is actually very impactful if, let's say, you have like a Vex 3. She could very easily just snipe the backline carry. But if you just put your main tank like right here, let's say the Poppy's the main tank again, the Vex is going to have a hard time getting through this, and it's actually not going to ult onto the Ashe right here. If your carry is on the same side as the Vex, it's very easy to dodge the Vex's ult. Essentially, just don't put your tank right in this line. In this line, the Vex would ult the Poppy and then hit the Ashe, but if you just move the Poppy 1 hex over, the Vex will no longer hit the Poppy. So typically, you want to be, the Vex player wants to be opposite side of the opponent's carry, and the opposing player wants to be same side as the Vex. Next we have Aatrox. Aatrox, personally, if he has tanky items, I like him to be on the outside to take damage from the enemy carry, ult as quickly as possible, and tank as long as possible for your team, as Aatrox's main job is to be very, very tanky. If he's drawing all the aggro initially, he can buy a lot of time for the rest of your team to actually do other stuff. If you don't have a tanky Aatrox, he's really not going to cast if you have him taking Focus Fire initially, so you're going to want to put him in the middle of your front line. That way, by the time he ults, he'll actually be able to get through the entire animation and get the bonus elf that he does when he ults, which will actually allow him to use the full extent of his tankiness. Because the problem is, if you put the Aatrox on the outside and he's not tanky, he doesn't have tank items, maybe he's 1-starred, a lot of times he'll die before his ult animation goes off because his ult animation is actually relatively slow. So just be careful with that. Technically, ideally, you also want to put Aatrox in front of their clump. The reasoning for this is his ult does a decent amount of damage in an AoE. So if you can put him in front of their clump, that's better than putting him away from the clump. Generally, I like to focus more on positioning him to be as tanky as possible. So either, again, if he's tank items, draw as much aggro as possible, and if he's not tank items, draw as little aggro as possible until he's gone through his ult. But if you can, getting him in front of a clump is very valuable. Next we have Garen. Garen simply just ults the largest clump of enemies nearby, so really all you want to do with Garen is you just want to position him in front of the enemy clump. There's not much else to it, just the closest you can get to the enemy's clump as possible, or as close as you can get to the enemy's carries, the better, because he's going to be more likely to actually hit that. Obviously, if your Garen is, let's say, left side here, and your opponent has a clump in top right, the Garen's not going to ult that. But if your enemy has a clump in the middle, he should still be able to hit it from here, which means that typically what people do is just put the Garen in the middle. That way he should be able to hit pretty much any clump on the board. So if you need to default, just default to middle Garen is probably your best bet. Again, if you're mecha hitting him, you want to typically just solo frontline him as you want your mecha to take initial aggro. The one exception would be something like a Fiddlestick, so you might want the Fiddle to take aggro before the Garen. So you might still just frontline a Fiddle with the Garen as well. But typically any other tank is going to be less tanky than the Garen, and so you don't want them to be on frontline. You want the Garen to take the initial aggro, get his mana pool up and ult. So any other tanks that I'm running, let's say I'm running like an Aatrox with him for some reason, I might want to put the Aatrox a row or two back. Otherwise, yeah, Garen's relatively simple. Just put him in front of their carry or their clump. Next we have Jhin. So the way Jhin's ult works is he always ults the lowest health enemy. Typically speaking, what I like to do is have Jhin in the corner, as it maximizes the odds that he hits a larger amount of units. Just due to the way geometry works. If he's ulting onto the opposite side here, he's more likely to hit through a lot of stuff. Typically, a lot of times what Jhin will do is ult the unit he's auto-attacking, because you have damage items on him, he's going to get them low HP, he's going to ult the unit he's auto-attacking. He'll typically be auto-attacking like some frontliners right here. So if you could get Jhin to like ult this Poppy right here, of course, this is going to hit technically more hexes in total than if you put the Jhin in the middle. Or like if the Poppy's in the middle, it's going to hit more hexes than straight back like this. This obviously doesn't always work out perfectly. They might have a low HP backliner like this Ashe here that he ults, and maybe you get lower value out of the middle. In this scenario, putting him, lower value out of the side. In this scenario, if you put him in the middle, he'd technically hit more units. What I like to do though is just put Jhin opposite side of their carry. Let's say they're carrying this Kale here, because then he might ult this Poppy on the front line, and the ult might go all the way to the Kale. Whereas the only way he's hitting this Ashe is if the Ashe is actually the lowest HP unit already, whereas he might actually splash onto the Kale potentially. Again, he might hit the Ashe again if the Poppy's right here, but people usually don't do this, so usually it's not as much of a concern. I'm not entirely sure about anything besides the corner. I've really only been playing Jhin in the corners. There might be justification for putting Jhin not in the corners. My biggest concern though is putting a unit into the middle of the board is typically just making them more CC susceptible. Which is why you see people typically put their carries on sides of the map. Part 1 for focus fire, part 2 because they're less CC susceptible, right? If you have CC coming straight down the middle, they're not going to get hit by it if they're in the corner. So I generally think Jhin just wants to be in the corner anyways. And yeah, that's basically it for Jhin. You just want Jhin to typically be opposite side of the carry. Next, we have Neeko. So Neeko's is interesting because her ult does 3 bounces to enemies who are nearby. And it does a small AoE damage, and then the third one does more damage. and does a larger area. Typically, I think what you want to generally do is have Neeko same side as the enemy carry. The reasoning for this is she is going to be more likely to bounce onto the backline, right? Let's say your opponent has maybe like Poppy here, Wukong here, I don't know, maybe like a Lux here and an Ashe here. Right, and maybe we move the Wukong here. If your Neeko ults the Poppy, there's a decent chance it's going to bounce back onto the Lux and then onto the Ashe and do damage to the Ashe if we're saying the Ashe is the carry. Whereas if the Ashe and Lux are back here, the odds are lower, right? The Neeko could just straight up ult onto the Poppy, onto the Wukong, and then it can actually just bounce back onto the Poppy. So being opposite side lowers the odds. A lot of times it ends up just bouncing around on the front line anyways, though. Your opponent puts some frontliners on front, let's say this Poppy, this Wukong, this Blitzcrank. It might just bounce between these three guys anyways. It's not a foolproof that she's going to ult onto the backline if she's same side. The other thing is that, of course, each hit does an AoE. So ideally what you want to do if you're positioning against Neeko is to declump your units. This includes your frontliners because they're the most likely to get hit. Now, the disadvantage to declumping is this. Again, let's say you have the Poppy, Blitzcrank, Wukong on frontline and the Ashe is your carry. In this case, the ult is just as likely to bounce between Poppy and Blitzcrank as it is to bounce between Poppy and Ashe. So you need to be very careful of this if you're going to spread out your frontline to make sure it doesn't potentially bounce onto your backline. So it's kind of a weird game that you don't want your units to be too spread out that you give a path to their carry, but you also don't want them to be too clumped up that it will just straight up kill everything. So if you're running like, 4 frontliners, maybe like this, spreading them out's your best bet. It should usually be bouncing between these frontliners here. And yeah, so generally declump versus Neeko. Of course, also try and declump your backline as well, because that way if the ult goes onto the backline, one is going to have less likely of a chance to explode onto your carry, and it's just going to do less damage overall, right? You don't want your frontline to be clumped because it's going to do more damage, right? Yeah, sure, one random frontliner dies is not the end of the world, whereas your carry dying kind of is. It just does more damage if it's hitting more frontliners. So generally declump versus Neeko if possible. Alright, so next we have TF. TF is just a pretty standard backline ranged carry. Most of his damage is single target, though he does have some AoE damage. So if you can declump versus him, it's nice, although it's not completely necessary like it would be versus, let's say, Neeko, because not all the damage is coming AoE. In fact, most of it's single target. Next we have Warwick. Personally with Warwick, I really think you should almost always be running Hacker with him. The reason I think you should always be running Hacker is it has a lot of benefits. The first and foremost is if you're running Hacker, you don't have to run Last Whisper anymore, which frees up an item slot for something else, which is really good. Because obviously if you're not hitting the strong tanky frontliners, Last Whisper is not as necessary. You're hitting the squishy backliners instead. And of course you're allowed to hit the squishy backliners. If you're putting your Warwick Hacker on one side, you have a 50% chance of just landing on their carry and killing it at the beginning of the fight, which is really, really valuable. If you're going to be defaulting to Hacker in your Warwick, just default to middle. Typically what will happen if you go middle is he's going to walk to either the top right or top left corner. He'll rarely walk to the front line. If you're not paying attention and you put Warwick on a side, what your opponent can do to easily counter this is put their units in the opposite corner and then their frontliners, like right here, either in the middle. Even if the frontliners are in the middle, the Warwick's going to jump back here and then walk onto the frontliners. So be careful of that. One thing you can try and do to deal with a middled Warwick is, let's say they jump Warwick middle. What you can do is throw a unit right here, and then you have only stuff in the corners. What's going to happen is the Poppy's going to walk up a bit, and the Warwick is going to land right here. The Poppy will probably have walked up right here at this point. Now in this positioning, the Warwick is closer to the Poppy than the Ashes. So what's happening is the Warwick is going to aggro onto the Poppy's going to walk up, and the Warwick's going to walk into the front line. Now that he's on the front line, he's going to stay on the front line until the front line is dead. This is bad for the Warwick player and very good for the Ashe player here, as they've allowed the Warwick to be dragged onto the front line. Obviously, the fix for this for the Warwick player is simply just to move a little over. If you just move slightly over, what's going to happen is the Poppy will walk up, the Warwick will land, and then of course it's closer to the Ashe now, so it's going to start auto-attacking the Ashe. That's a bit of a tech you can do if your opponent's just putting the Warwick in middle to drag it away. Obviously, if the Warwick is on a side, what you really need to do is just get your carry onto the other side, ideally. There's other techs you can do versus hackers. Like you can frontline your carry versus a hackered Warwick, but that's obviously bad for many reasons. unless you know you're fighting the hacker player. But yeah, typically you just want your carry to be opposite side. If you can, put a tanky-ish ranged unit next to your carry. That way the Warwick jumps down, maybe like the Morgana we were talking about earlier. You throw this Morgana next to your carry, the Warwick's going to spend some time killing the Morgana. The Morgana might be able to CC the Warwick, and it'll buy some time for your carry. What you really want to have happen is your carry to kill their frontliner before the Warwick kills the unit next to your carry, because then your carry will start hitting the Warwick first, start damaging it and all that stuff. And potentially kill it before the Warwick kills your carry. Of course, the most foolproof way is just put your carry opposite side of the Warwick. You can theoretically run Warwick without hacker. I think it's significantly worse. I personally think Warwick should pretty much always be hackered. But if for some reason you're running Warwick without hacker, I typically would just put him on the second row. I really like this corner right here, as it keeps him nice and safe. He only has to walk up 1 hex, and you always know where he's going to walk, but he's never getting targeted first. He can start killing the units around here. And then let's say your units like walk around like this. If he kills the Wukong here, he's going to walk onto their backline and start killing stuff there. So it's kind of a pseudo hacker. There's a bit of attack you can do here as well, where if you were to, let's say, throw a Zephyr right here, it'll Zephyr the Wukong. The Wukong will get Zephyred. Your frontline will clump around this unit. And now the closest unit to your Warwick is actually the Ashe, so it'll walk over to this Ashe and again be on the backline as well. So that's a tech you can do with any melee carry. It's been around since like set 2 people have been doing this, where you can Zephyr a frontliner and have it be a pseudo hacker. Of course, you may not want the Warwick to be on the complete outside for some reason. If not, you could just put him like here and he'll walk between these units. But generally, I would just put him either here or here, because he'll do the same thing, but walking right here. And finally, the final unit we have is Ultimate Ezreal. Ultimate Ezreal's positioning is really weird. Well, positioning your Ultimate Ezreal actually doesn't matter very much. He's quite easy to position, because his positioning doesn't matter that much. You generally just want him to focus fire the same side as what other AD carry you're running. So let's say you're running a Samira. Ideally, what you want to do is put the Ez and the Samira on the same side. One big mistake I see people do is they'll put the Ezreal and the Samira on opposite sides. And I highly disagree with this. Now, the advantage of this and the reason people do this is it's a bit safer, right? Let's say your opponent hackers onto the Samira, you still have the Ez alive. Let's say the opponent hackers onto the Ez, you still have the Samira alive. Let's say the opponent CCs the Samira, the Ez is still autoing, and let's say your opponent CCs the Ez, the Samira is still autoing. And sometimes this is completely correct, but a lot of the times I think this is incorrect and people will just default to this. What you ideally want to do is have the Ez and the Samira on the same side. The reason for this is what we were talking about way earlier, is that you generally want to be focus firing your units. And so I would highly recommend having, your Ez and your Samira focus firing the same unit. The reason this is really important for AD champions is a lot of their damage comes from auto attacks. So having your 2 units auto attacking the same thing has a lot of value, especially if you're running Last Whisper. Those auto attacks are becoming close to true damage when you're running a Last Whisper. And so they're actually doing a lot of damage. So typically put your Ezreal on same side as your other AD carries, if possible. Sometimes you do have to spread them out though, because you're too vulnerable to hackers or CC or whatnot. In addition, Ezreal's ult, the Ezreals that are spawned from his ult will always hit the largest clump. So make sure if you're versus an ultimate Ezreal, you do not clump your team, because then they're just going to ult your team and kill everything. If you declump your team entirely, Ultimate Ezreal actually isn't that strong currently. So if you can declump, he won't do that much damage. And will actually struggle to kill things. So he'll do a decent amount of damage, but not hit the same units multiple times. And yeah. So that's that for the positioning for every unit in set 8.5. I'll be releasing a video soon covering every comp you can play in set 8.5. There's going to be a lot of comps that I'm going to go over. I'll release a guide with that as well. So make sure to subscribe and check that out when I post that if that's something you're interested in. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And thank you for watching.